In 1935 he joined the civil service.
I inherited Brian O'Nolan, or Miles McCoplin as he lives in history, literary history, from the late P.J. Rutledge, who was my predecessor in what was then the Department of Local Government and Public Health.
Sean McEntee, whose private secretary he was.
He had been private secretary to Mr. Rutledge, and ordinary normal course, Mr. Rutledge's successor would have taken him over unless he had found that he was in some way temperamentally or otherwise unsuited, because private secretaries and ministers have to work very closely with each other, and if there's not sort of empathy between them, they tend to get at cross purposes, and it's always unpleasant, and very unpleasant to have to change a private secretary. I didn't have to do that with Miles. Miles was, in my opinion, a very efficient private secretary. He wasn't obtrusive. He did, of course, read correspondence as it came to me, and he passed it up to me with a brief comment on it as to whether it was really serious or worth. And the minister has, you see, he can't waste all his time reading letters. He just has to read those which appear to be significant. And Miles was very good at that. He was able to sift the wheat from the chaff, to put before me the letters which were really relevant to my responsibilities. I couldn't let outside any other department. He'd say what the subject was about, and he'd say, well, I'll pass it on to the department if it relates to me for their comments, or I'll pass it on to whatever was the appropriate department.
In 1937, his father died suddenly. Miles was the eldest of his 12 children.
They're a family of 12, and his father died shortly after he left college.
His wife, Flann O'Brien.
I think Brian felt he was the one to do something at the time. So as he was in the civil service and had a fairly good job, he contributed. So a lot of the family were still at school.
Round about, I think it was the autumn of 35 or the early 36, Brian said he was going to write a book, and he had already started on it, and he used to just give me long descriptions of the sort of philosophical and intellectual background to the book. But then he began to bring in pieces of it, you know, as he typed it, and I discovered, to my astonishment, that I was one of the main characters under the name of Brinsley, and he used to bring these successive excerpts from the work in progress for me to look at and to get a comment from me. And this was the most peculiar feeling of living within existing in another mode, as it were, within a work which is still actually being created and in fact changed by the very fact of coming in and talking to me. One day I get a wonderful thing I got from some tipster in Newmarket with that wonderful language, you know, the racing, you know, get on this cast iron so-and-so cert. And he was so taken with this that it went straight into the next chapter of the book, and it's still there, you know. Then I had published with John MacDonagh a book of poems, and one of them was a translation from Catullus, Ad Lesbiam, which is one of the Lesbia poems, and he said, give me a copy of that. So I gave him this, and the next thing, it appears in the book in toto, attributed to Brinsley. But to this day, quite a lot of people think that he wrote this poem, you know. Then when he had the thing finished, I said to him, look, it's too long. It was about 800 pages of typescript. I said, it's far too long. Well, he said, if you think that, you can bloody well cut it yourself. I'm sick of it. So I chopped out about 25-30% of it. I wish I'd kept them now.
On the best authorities, only 600 copies of That Swim Two Birds were sold in Ireland.
Micheál O'Hay.
Well, now that is a very, very poor response to a writer whom most people say we knew from the beginning. He was, that he was a genius of the first water.
If the war hadn't come when it did, you see, his book At Swim Two Birds came out on September the 3rd, I believe, 1939. It certainly came out in September 1939, and would have been a tremendous, acclaimed critically, because even the few reviewers who were dispassionate enough to be able to review it without worrying about other things which were happening then, gave it rave notices, but not enough. There wasn't enough interest to get him as a writer off the ground.
And given his family responsibilities, he needed to earn more than his civil service salary.
I introduced him to Bertie Smiley in the Old Palace Bar, and Bertie took to him very quickly. They got on wonderfully well.
Neil Sheridan on the beginnings of Miles Nagopoline's Irish Times career.
And within 10 minutes he had hired Miles to do a column for the Irish Times. At first it was only in Irish, and a rather ludicrous situation developed because there was nobody in the Irish Times who could read Irish. You know, they were in the same position as I was in relation to the Old Irish. And after about a week, Smiley rang me up and said, he said, I'm getting stuff here, and we can't read it. Would you read it for us? So I had the ludicrous position where they were sending this stuff to me to read for libel and various other things, unknown to Brian.
The first time that, let me see, yes, it would have been, I think, the first time I ever actually saw him.
Ben Kiley.
Was in DeLear Street, and R.M. Smiley was standing there as impassive as the legs of stone in the desert, to him, puffing at the pipe. And Miles was standing much smaller than him and arguing and dabbing his forefinger at him. What the argument was about, I do not know. I suspect it was about what R.M. was not paying for the column or something of that sort. But it was the impassivity of the enormous man and the sort of Gallic activity of Brian that made the whole scene really worth photographing it. So I certainly photographed it in my memory. I can see them still.
He used to have them quite often, though not very often face to face.
Difficulties between Smiley and Miles, as remembered by Jack White.
They did, of course, sometimes meet. They met drinking together, and then they were usually quite amiable, and Miles would sometimes make fun of Smiley or jibe at him, but this was all done in quite a friendly spirit. On the other hand, when changes had been made to his copy, or to be more accurate, we didn't change his copy, we sometimes cut it. He then used to write in letters the most fearsome invective against the editor, and sometimes he was sufficiently affronted to withdraw his services altogether.
Meanwhile, his day job was working as private secretary for Sean McEntee in the Department of Local Government and Health.
He worked very conscientiously. I must say that I arrived reasonably early at my office. Miles was there before me. When I was leaving, it was generally late in the evening, Miles was then engaged in his own private business. That's to say, he was sitting at the typewriter, typing out his stuff, I think, for the Irish Times.
There was a period, especially I think during his early career, when Miles Nagopoline made it quite a habit of using his column to pick up the editorials, the leaders that Smiley had written, to make fun of them, to perform tricks with them, and to ridicule them in all sorts of ways. And Smiley himself, as editor, enjoyed this enormously. I remember that at one stage the column and the leader appeared on the same page, and there used to be a hand printed in the column pointing over towards your man over there. This was the leader writer. Now, Smiley, as I say, found this highly amusing, and I'm not sure that there was an editor of a serious newspaper in these islands who would have put up with that sort of performance from one of his contributors. And it's a great measure of the man himself that he was able to accept this as another feature of what was an eccentric, but in some ways a very great newspaper.
In his college days, he was much like any of the rest of us. He writes about this in At Swim Two Birds. He drank a lot of stout, which was the cheapest drink. A bottle of stout then cost 6 and a pint 7, as far as I remember. He was never a real drinker until, I would think, during the war. After he had begun to write the column in the Irish Times.
He loved his pubs, and he had a great selection of them, and he made all his social contacts. Indeed, you might say his social life was very, very much in the pubs of Dublin.
John Ryan.
And I remember once I made a list of the ones that I remembered knowing him to see, and it was alarmingly long. It made me even begin to worry about myself that I'd known him in so many different ones.
I can't claim to have been an intimate of Brian on no lines, or to have known him well over a long period.
Shaun McCrimmon.
I did get to know him on that level of casual intimacy that pub conversations sometimes engenders. We talked at times about those safe topics that you can talk about in pubs, politics and the less profound reaches of the arts, and people in the public eye and people in the private eye, and you can say a lot without saying very much. But I found his conversation on that level entertaining, at times abrasive, as he was just as abrasive as he could be in print. But I must say that I found him a less formidable person, in the off-putting sense, than legend had made out.
It was very interesting to go anywhere with Brian.
His wife, Evelyn O'Newloin.
Because he always got into conversation very easily. I mean, if we went into a pub or a hotel or anything like that, he would get talking to somebody, and very interesting conversations with the ordinary person, you know.
We would have been in, of course, the castle, which was a continuation of MacDaid's, and some of the old pubs, they really haven't altered that much. Some of them have even developed in character, but I couldn't see him in a lot of the very, very fancy downtown lounges or anything of that sort, or even the very great suburban lounges, those enormous filling stations. They're too unintimate for him. He belonged at the counter and with a small circle, or behind the barrel and the bodega and that sort of thing.
Miles was just a sort of a drinkard, if I could use that word, as against a drunkard or an alcoholic. He was a drinkard. He enjoyed drinking. He enjoyed the social company of people in pubs. It was like the cafe life was to the Parisian of the last century. The pub was to him. But of course, like everybody who's continuously doing it, it gets progressively worse for them.
This morning's programme was based on original programmes by David McHugh, John Skehan, Eamon Morrissey, Micheál O'Hay and myself. More on Miles Nagopaline, Flann O'Brien, Brian O'Nolan at the same time on Sunday morning next. Thank you for listening this morning, and good morning.
That programme was presented and produced by John Bowman.